So it's now my great pleasure to introduce Tim Thompson, who is the senior attorney at the Housing Justice Project. That we call that
Housing Justice Center.
Housing Justice Center. It used to be the Housing Preservation Project. I managed to mangle both names quite nicely there. So anyway, Tim and I have known each other for a long time. He's a strong advocate for manufactured homeowners, and he's a great presenter both locally and nationally. And so we, mostly Tim, are going to talk about consolidated and comprehensive planning, which are tools that are very vital that you all know about, so that you can exercise your right at the local level. As we mentioned earlier, sometimes working at the local level is the place to start. And this is ways that you can help try to preserve your manufactured housing going forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Tim and go from there. You hold it like this towards there.
Let me see first if you can hear me without the mic.
Yeah.
Okay? We can not bother with that. The Housing Justice Center is a public interest law firm focused on preserving and expanding the supply of affordable housing. We work throughout Minnesota, and we do a fair amount of work nationally as well. And we have a very long history of partnering with APAC to work to support a lot of manufactured home communities in Minnesota and also around the country on a variety of issues.
You can let people know before I start page 9.
So the PowerPoint starts on page 9 apparently, so if you want to follow along. So what I would like to do today is to kind of talk about the subject of getting support for your communities at the local government level, and what are the various levers or strategies that you could use to kind of build that support and help your communities in a variety of ways. Next slide. So, why focus on local governments? Probably a lot of you have a pretty good idea about this. And by the way, I am hopeful that you will not only jump in at any point with comments, but give examples or experiences you've had in your own communities dealing with local government for good or for ill. So, as many of you know, of course, local governments can have a big impact on your communities, either for better or worse. And of course, you want to have them be an ally and a supporter of your communities wherever possible. So, and that's of course because there are a variety of different ways in which local governments, whether they are cities or counties or townships, can affect your communities. One issue that we have seen repeatedly in Minnesota is parks that are either under the threat or actual redevelopment and closure. And one of the things that local governments, of course, pay a lot of attention to is land use planning and development planning, and what areas are going to stay the same and what areas of the city are going to change. And so local governments are always thinking about that and planning about it and in discussion with developers. One of the places that all of that happens are in city comprehensive plans. That's a term here in Minnesota, but I think it also is true in many places around the country, which is typically a state law requirement that local governments regularly do long-term planning in a whole variety of areas, one of which is housing. Zoning can become an issue that may have a big impact on you. One of the areas where it does is, again, where an owner of a park, if you have an investor owner, they're considering redevelopment, it will be a lot easier for them to redevelop and close the park if the zoning allows them to convert to use. Whereas if the zoning is such that the use they want to make, whether it's to tear it down and build high-end condos or a hotel or something, if that use is not currently permitted in the zoning, it means they have to seek from the local government permission to rezone, which gives you an avenue to try to protect your park and get the city to not do that. So that's an issue that's key. Another way that local governments,
I think this is slide to the zoning article?
Yeah, please do.
So, yeah, what Tim says is absolutely right in terms of challenging a zoning plan that would result in your displacement, but also what we're doing in Washington State is going proactively to the city councils and saying our communities are currently zoned either commercial or multifamily, and therefore we're at risk, and we want you to zone the communities as manufactured housing communities, to get the zoning back so that they can't really be sold for any other purpose. And we've done that in 4 different jurisdictions in Washington State. The first one was in 2008, and that started out with the homeowners in a small town called Tumwater just attending the city council meetings and saying, we're concerned that communities across the state are closing and homeowners are being displaced. This was in the height of the housing bubble in the mid-2000s, and we did in Washington State have over 50 communities closed and more than 2,000 households were displaced. So these homeowners were proactive, went to the city council, identified a couple of council members who were supportive, who'd done their electioneering through the communities, had been into the mobile home parks and had met people. And ultimately, the City Council of Tumwater passed a zoning ordinance to preserve 7 of the 10 communities in that jurisdiction. They didn't do them all because a couple of them were very, very, very tiny and didn't make any sense. And one of them was very, very large on a very busy commercial thoroughfare that they knew just wasn't going to work to save that one. But then the park owners, of course, challenged that zoning ordinance through the Growth Management Act process and through federal court. They went all the way up to the 9th Circuit. And the 9th Circuit ruled in 2012 that that city ordinance was valid, that the city had that right to preserve, through its own police powers, and protect that living situation, to preserve those manufactured housing communities. So since then, we've gone to 3 other jurisdictions in Washington State and had it done, and we're currently working in 2 or 3 other jurisdictions in Washington State. So going jurisdiction by jurisdiction can really make a difference, because it's easy, or it's easier, for homeowners to attend city council meetings than it might be for them to go to the state legislature. It's much more likely that you're going to bump into a city council member at the grocery store line, at your church, or wherever, so you can develop really strong personal relationships with them. And you have a real opportunity to show them, invite them to your community and show them why it's important that they preserve this style of housing. And the Comprehensive Act, the Growth Management Act in a lot of states has very specific criteria that the cities and counties have to follow when they're looking at housing. And for housing, it is that you preserve existing neighborhoods, that you provide a variety of housing options, that you provide housing for all economic sectors of the population, and that you provide density. And manufactured housing communities, check, 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 right? They meet all of those criteria. So it's very, very difficult for the elected officials to then go, well, we can't really do this. Well, actually, yes, you can. And so we've got a lot of arguments in our favor to look at local zoning. And I think it's a really good way to move forward and help you build at the local level very strong coalitions of homeowners. So I would love to talk with anyone more about that who's interested. Yeah, Carol.
When you say we, who's we?
We is the Association of Manufactured Homeowners, AMO, in Washington State. And there's Sharon and Vanessa there. So they're the 2 from Washington State that you can talk with about that. And I help them, I help write some funding for them, so some of their funding pays for some of my time, and so I've been working with AMO to do that, but I'd be happy to work with other states as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Great strategy and really pioneering work. Ishbel, do you know of other states, if that's happening at this point?
Colorado.
Okay.
California.
Okay. So other areas where local government practices may affect your communities. Many local governments have financial assistance programs for either homeowners or renters, loans or grants, often for rehab purposes. They may or may not have those programs structured well to meet the needs of residents of manufactured home parks, and sometimes they fall within the gaps. And so you may want to look at whether those sorts of programs are meeting your needs as well. Regulatory enforcement, local code requirements, they can be done in a way which really is helpful and improves your communities, or they can be enforced in a way that's really problematic and causes hardship for people. And again, having kind of a sensitive understanding on the part of local code officials about the needs and issues in your communities is really helpful. Local government utility practices. We've seen a number of instances in Minnesota, particularly in smaller towns, where the city is providing water services to the park. The park owner pays the bill. They get into financial trouble. They stop paying the bill, and the city has to decide whether to use what is usually its only remedy, which is to cut off service. And so in those sorts of situations, you also want a city that is sensitive to the needs of the residents and looks for other options to enforce those kind of payment obligations instead of simply cutting off service. So those are kind of, and there may well be other ways in which local governments affect your communities. Anybody have any to mention that I haven't mentioned?
I've worked with the city of Reedsport because they have problems with their pumping stations not being able to support the community, which affected several manufactured home parks and created situations where it was creating unhealthy conditions. And through the city and representing manufactured home parks, we were able to submit for grants where they can get financing to improve their pumping stations and possibly relocate where homeowners who would be affected by this. So we got approval for relocation. So working with the city on that and getting it approved, we are able to, it looks like we've won the grants from FEMA and HUD for the city of Reedsport. And it does work, and the city of Reedsport has been very, very supportive of our program hosted now.
Any particular advice about what worked well with the city?
Just go in there and talk to them and let them know who you are and that you're there to help them in any way you can. Just look for that open doors. Support them when they ask you to attend their meetings, attend them. You have some power and you got to take advantage of it, yes.
Good example.
I do have a couple examples. We have a city councilwoman in her first term, and she's been a local resident all her life, and has these political ambitions. And I could see that, and because I know her personally, when we had an ugly, old unit being brought in that looked like it had been moved from a field, brought in, okay, owned by Kingsley. I didn't want to focus on any one particular one, but anyway, a resident, a neighbor next to the area that it was to be brought in called me and said they are going to let someone move into this ugly thing. And I thought, well, what can I do? Well, first of all, I called Carol because she was actually on the board and I wasn't on the board of the HOA. And she was in California, and she said, well, Helen, you'll have to do something. So I thought, what do I do? So I called this councilwoman, and she said, I'll be there. Well, she went there and saw that not only was it too big, it was too far away, too close to the park, the walkway path, but from the front. Well, anyway, long story short, we ended up having the manager there. We ended up having her on the phone with the Kingsley representative for us. It ended up that they not only the old investor in the unit not only had forged the permit, but had not checked with the city. The whole thing was illegal. And eventually, after lawyers discussed it, it was taken out. Then another one across the street from me, about 6:30 or 7:30 at night, this ugly unit, huge half unit was brought in, so that by the time, and I asked them, are you actually going to try to fit that into that lot? And they said, oh yes, we have the other one at the office area. It was now dark enough that they had to use flashlights. I thought, do I dare, at 9:30 at night, call the city councilwoman? And I said to myself, yes. I called her and I said, Christy, I know it's late, but we have an issue very important here. She said, I'll be there. She came and she immediately saw that it wouldn't meet code. She talked to the men who were bringing it in. They said, we're just workers. She said, then call your boss. He came and he tried to argue with her. She said, I'm sorry, you have to stop now. And I will say she was not aggressive. She was not in a militant attitude, and she is never. Anyway, they said, okay, so that we'll have someone come. She said, we'll have an inspector come tomorrow morning. We'd like you here. She and the inspector went an hour earlier than that time, and they measured everything, and they were able to open the door and see that inside it was deplorable. Took pictures because they knew they were going to have a battle with the lawyer. Well, when they did, over a week went by as they rattled back and forth, city lawyer with Kingsley lawyer. The unit was taken out. I now am sure that if you get your city council person involved, particularly if they have political ambitions, and she's now up for re-election, and she's using this experience as a positive for her service. Anyway, it's working for us as we now have residents who were apathetic now looking out as we tell them, we don't know everything that's going on in the park. We can't see it all, but if you see a unit coming in that you know is not going to enhance the park, call us, call Christy. So we now have not really a neighborhood watch, but we have residents who know that it works.
Paying attention.
Great example using, yep.
One of the most important things that we were able to accomplish is that we forced Kingsley to go to the city first to get the permits, which they were not getting, and to prove that they are licensed and insured. So now they've had to change who hauls their units in, because the guy who was doing it before was on the Kingsley payroll, and they were protecting him from having to give all that information. Yeah. So now we know that when they're being hauled in, that they've got the permits and the proof of insurance and licensing, and it's posted on the unit, and we also got code enforcement involved. So now code enforcement will come out and go through the unit before it can be sold.
I might mention that investor was banned not only from the park but from the state, because he was doing this in other parks illegally.
So attend your city council meetings, get people from your parks to agree to do that for you. Go every single time they have a meeting and build a relationship with the council.
Yes.
Great example. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things, we don't have a state org, but we have we have about 4 or 5 homeowners that are really pissed off. And we have a county board of supervisors in our area, and the office is literally 2 miles from our community. So we went over there and introduced ourselves, and we're sharing with our county supervisor what was going on in our community, that sidewalks were deteriorating, streets were deteriorating, all this stuff. So I went around the park with another member and another homeowner, and we took pictures of all the bad sidewalk and all of the bad asphalt in the community. And we sent them to his chief of staff. And she immediately sent an email back saying, I'm forwarding these to the zoning commission in Fairfax County, and we're going to make sure that they come out and inspect the sidewalks, because they can't do anything about our streets, according to them, but they could do something about the sidewalks. So they came and determined that what we were finding was accurate. People were getting injured walking on the sidewalks. And so the zoning guy came out and he's issued a 30-day notice to begin reparations. And this is to an ELS community. This is, you know, talking to ELS is like talking to a wall. But anyway, they sent this notice and we warned the guy. We said, listen, ELS is going to come back and say to you, it's not in the budget. We can't do that. And then I said, don't believe them. They have more money than God. And so he listened to what we said. They issued the 30-day notice, and out of about, I don't know how many thousands of yards of concrete, we had about 400 yards fixed. But the community has 500 homes, and there's a lot of concrete that still hadn't been done. But the point is, after you send something like that, paperwork and documentation, to the county supervisor's office, you've got to follow up with them on a regular basis, because they didn't enforce that 30-day notice. Once they fixed that 400 yards, they told the county supervisor, that's all we can do this year. That was 4 years ago. And they still haven't fixed the rest of the concrete. So we're sending notices to the zoning board, do your job, or we're going to have somebody else in your job. So it's just, and it's not like we have a state org that can do this. We're just a bunch of homeowners who are really pissed off. So.
Great. Let's go to the next slide. So this is something we're already talking about, right? Getting local government on your side. We've heard a number of great examples of people effectively doing that. A lot of you are engaged in this friendly persuasion, which can veer off into pissed off advocacy at times. Right? It all works. But one of the things that I want to talk about is there are also some other leverage or levers that you can pull to try to get your various government, local governments more proactive in working to help and protect your communities. And those levers may exist under state, regional, or local laws or programs. One of the things that is true in Minnesota, and I think it's true in many other states, is that there is, as we all deal with this chronic shortage of affordable housing, there is a growing recognition about how important it is to preserve the affordable housing that we have. Too often, policymakers aren't thinking about manufactured home communities when they're thinking about that, but of course they ought to be, right?
Yep.
And one of the things that's particularly striking is that if you look at the supply of housing that typically houses low and moderate income households, manufactured home communities are some of the only resources that do this without government funding, right? Yeah. Making it a particularly critical resource and one that too often policymakers aren't thinking about. Let's go to the next slide.
Can I make a comment? Even though some people are not looking at manufactured home or the cost of being a homeowner, have you seen in the media a lot of attention going to the teeny houses, the tiny houses? Yeah. Well, people are having to do an alternative for living. And so because they aren't able to get financing, then they're going to these teeny houses that they can pay $4,500 or whatever, and they can afford that. But then they're going to run into a problem as to where to put it. So there's going to be another thing coming up beyond manufactured home problems with these teeny houses. So there isn't, people are having to find a way to live and still feel like a homeowner.
And the interesting thing is when it comes to building affordable rental housing, funders are really concerned these days at the cost of new construction of apartment buildings. Here in Minnesota, the average new apartment costs well over $200,000 a unit. And so they're always trying to figure out how do we reduce costs, which has created a lot of interest in ways to build smaller units or more cost-efficient units. And again, it's a great reminder that in some ways we're already doing this, right? And we just have to figure out how to do more of that. So I'm going to talk about an example in Minnesota that we have had some success. And this, I'm hopeful that at least parts of this will transfer or be applicable to other areas around the country, even if it's not in exactly the same way. Here in the Twin Cities, we have a regional government called the Metropolitan Council, which is responsible for a lot of things. It runs the transit system and the sewer system. It's responsible for long-range planning, land use planning throughout the metropolitan area. And it has some responsibilities in the housing area. It runs some low-income housing programs, and it oversees some of the planning that local governments have to do around affordable housing. And that's kind of one of the key areas. So a group of us as advocates see that local governments can make a big difference in affordable housing generally, in making it easier or more difficult to build and to preserve. And one of the ways that you get those local governments to be more responsive to affordable housing needs is if you have an effective regional government that is trying to make those local governments do what they're supposed to do. So that's an area we have focused on here. And we have focused on the Metropolitan Council in terms of two of its jobs. One of its jobs is as a regulator, and this is where comprehensive planning comes into play. So in Minnesota, and I think it's similar in many states, local governments have an obligation to do long-term planning with a lot of citizen input on a whole variety of areas that local government practices affect, including housing and specifically affordable housing. So that's an area that we have focused on and I'll be talking more about. And then the second area is the Metropolitan Council gives out grants to local governments, which gives them some leverage over what they're getting from those local governments in return. And so we have focused a lot on how can the Metropolitan Council use its funding leverage to get local governments to do the kind of things we want them to do. Next slide. So to focus a little more specifically around this comprehensive planning thing, it all sounds very abstract and long-term in some ways, but it is really, it's the roadmap or the plan for what local government is supposed to do, and these plans make a big difference, and they provide a real source of leverage for these issues we're concerned about. So in Minnesota, every 10 years, every local government has to do an updated comprehensive plan. So here, the next ones are coming in 2018. We've got 180 local governments in the Twin Cities metro area, between cities and counties and townships, and they all have to do these plans. And what state law requires is that every local government has to plan for its share of the local and the regional need for affordable housing. which means it has to set aside enough land that's zoned at an appropriate level that affordable housing could be built, and it has to come up with an action plan or an implementation plan which will show how they're going to get that done over the course of the next decade. This last couple of years, the Metropolitan Council has adopted a new regional housing policy plan, which is kind of the first one in the Twin Cities in 3 decades, actually. So it sets the stage for this next round of comprehensive planning, and one of the things that was a new feature in this planning is a new emphasis on preservation. How do we preserve the housing we got? What are more proactive strategies that local governments can do to make sure that happens, with specific calling out of manufactured home park communities as part of that. The implementation plan or the action plan means the city is supposed to look at all of its affordable housing policies, its programs, its zoning and land use practices, its funding, and figure out how all of those things are going to work together to meet these affordable housing goals. We have worked on several cycles of these comprehensive plans, trying to make them as effective as possible. And what we found is the quality of those plans varies enormously. Some of them are very good, some of them are very short and very vague and say things like, well, we will consider doing this, or we might look into that. And then when you find they never actually follow through and do any of those things they promised to do. So the key is getting a really good, thoughtful plan that is really designed to kind of accomplish these goals. And then it's really important to make sure the city follows through on that plan. I don't know how many cases I have seen where the city said, we are committed to doing this over the next 10 years, and then 10 years later you ask them and a new city council's been elected and they completely ignore it.
I have 2 comments. One is, we have a state, it was a trust fund, now it's a loan fund, and so we are trying to connect these plans to that, so if they don't have certain criteria in the plan, they can't receive that state funding for preserving or more affordable housing. So that's a good way to look at things and put teeth in. The other thing is that the city just, they're doing a 5,000 door campaign, and they want to produce and preserve 5,000 homes in 5 years. And this is a great way for us to go in and have a conversation about the parks within Salt Lake City and maintain it. And I started the discussion a little bit last week, and we're going to set up a meeting to talk about it, but there's so many units, and if we can preserve them, it would be a huge one.
That's great. And that example of using that funding leverage is exactly what I've been talking about.
I'd like to just add, a lot of states have, you mentioned Tara, the Housing Trust Fund, now a loan fund in Utah. Washington State has a Housing Trust Fund, which is generated from tax revenue. And in the past, we've been able to make sure that there's been a set aside in that Housing Trust Fund specifically for the preservation of manufactured housing communities. And some nonprofit housing entities and some housing authorities have been able to access that funding and leveraged other funding to preserve several manufactured housing communities. So if you've got an opportunity to get your state housing trust fund to have a set aside for manufactured housing preservation, is definitely worth working on.
I have one other comment. I believe in California, and I want to chat with you about it, but Morgan Stanley, which is a bank, they're really interested in helping preserve manufactured home parks, and so they're trying to replicate that in Utah, and the conversation that started there. So I want to chat with you about it, but it's showing an outside entity that is being supported, and how do we tie that in? So.
Let's go to the next slide. So to continue for a minute on comprehensive plans, right now cities are starting to gear up for what is about a 2-year process of writing these plans with lots of opportunity for citizen input. And typically, what most local governments find is that it's really hard to get people interested in long-term planning unless they think it's going to directly affect their property. Right?
Yeah.
So what it means is there are real opportunities for you all to get involved in this kind of thing, because typically cities are quite eager to get citizen input on these long-term plans. And showing up makes all the difference. The other thing that leaves us very hopeful is that in this case, one of the things that the advocates really worked on with the Metropolitan Council is to make sure that when they review these affordable housing plans cities are drafting, they actually are much more rigorous in their review. The last time around, the Metropolitan Council typically said, oh, I see you've got a plan, and they check the box. Now they have committed to looking at whether that plan is actually designed to accomplish the goals it's supposed to achieve. So this allows all of you to insist that the city gets much more specific in looking at ways that they can enhance and protect your communities. And there is, in this plan and in the regional housing plan, an explicit recognition of manufactured home park communities per se as an important resource to protect, and that's new in the plan this year. So we are trying to mobilize advocates. We're working now on making sure that the Met Council's instructions to cities on writing their plans are as robust as possible. And then advocates plan to be involved in a lot of communities to make sure that those plans are written as effectively as possible. And then, of course, over the long term, going back to cities and making sure they do what they promised to do.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Since there's a broad definition of affordable housing, do you guys ever bring in to the picture the cost for manufactured home communities and what it costs us to actually live in our community? Because with the lot rents crazy with the owner, and if you have a mortgage on top of that, affordable could mean anything. And each community is going to be a little different depending on where they're located. Because there's a big discussion in Washington about affordable housing, but everybody defines it differently. So I'm wondering how you all deal with that.
Yeah. So one of the ways that that issue got addressed in the regional housing plan this time around was there is a recognition that affordable means different things to different people, and of course, the general goal is to provide affordable housing for low and moderate income households, and that covers a pretty big range.
Yeah.
What the council decided this time around is that when local governments are planning for how they're going to meet their share of the regional and local need, they need to look at the lowest income group and the group above that and the group above that, each of those groups individually, and how much the need is and how much of that effort to kind of look at all the levels of affordability within there.
Okay.
So the best data is with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. So if you go on their line, they'll give you every county in your state and what, 30% of AMI can afford. So maybe for a 1, 2, 3 bedroom. And so you can correlate it to manufactured.
Yeah, we've got all that stuff in Virginia, but the problem is everybody's defining it differently, and that's it. Like you said, having it part of the discussion in the city council, that's huge, because they're not even talking about it.
You really define it as paying only 30% of your income to housing. If you're not living in that housing, then you're not living in housing you can afford. So that is really the baseline of your conversation.
Yeah.
Because then you can talk about the gap. So if somebody's paying 30% of AMI and they're paying, $700 and they only can afford, $400, there's a $300 gap there that is coming from somewhere. So.
Yeah.
So to just give you a sense of how Minnesota communities have typically addressed manufactured home communities in their previous comp plans, the ones we've looked at, they all most of them typically will have a section in which they will describe existing affordable housing in the community, and they'll mention their manufactured home parks. Some of them will have a section about long-term land use planning and where they expect change to happen. And in some places, you will see cities who are saying, we're committed to preserving these parks and as a long-term resource. In other cases, you will see the plans saying, we anticipate that long-term this park is likely to be redeveloped. And so that's one thing you really need to pay attention to, and that is an area where you need to get local governments who are thinking about redevelopment opportunities to realize the importance of preserving these parks. Next slide. So, aside from effective planning, the other tool that we got the Met Council to successfully use to get the attention of cities is what are the strings, or how do they give out their money? The Metropolitan Council provides several different kinds of grants to cities and counties and townships. There are economic development and housing grants. There are, and more recently, there are very large transportation grants. In the past, we convinced the Metropolitan Council that when they are considering who gets these grants, they ought to take into account the affordable housing performance by those local governments.
Yeah.
And so they created something called housing performance scores, which is a report card annually for every city, which you get a score between 0 and 100 based on a number of criteria that are designed to show how well you are doing on your affordable housing efforts. And part of that is preservation, and part of that is promoting new production. They applied that criteria to these grants. The big breakthrough we made this year is we got the Metropolitan Council to apply this housing performance score criteria when they were giving out transportation funding, which is the big pot of money. They give out like $150 million a year. So what this means is if you've got a local government that is so-so or neutral or not very motivated about affordable housing, but they really want that road project, they're going to realize that they've got to step up their game on affordable housing if they hope to get that road project. And that has proven already to be a really effective motivating tool. So that's a way that you can really get the attention of cities. And so one of the things that we got in here for the first time this year is when they revised that scorecard, the housing performance scorecard, cities get extra points for taking actions to help or protect manufactured home parks. So now they specifically see that in there, and we're hopeful that that's going to make a real significant difference.
I think one of the challenges there is that sometimes that transportation money could result in the displacement of people in manufactured housing communities.
Yeah.
Oftentimes rapid transit or something like that tends to be right through the path of the park, so there's conflict presumably there.
Yep, and that raises an issue that, of course, local governments aren't the only governments that affect your communities. The State Department of Transportation has had a number of cases where they had road projects that they wanted to, which would have meant either eliminating or reducing the size of existing manufactured home parks. And APAC had a fair amount of success a few years ago with raising this issue with MnDOT and getting them to adopt some more sensitive policies. So there are other governments, of course, to pay attention to as well.
So if we wanted to see that formula, we could just go on the Metropolitan Council?
Yes.
Do they have all that on that?
Yep, they do have all that on there, so, yeah. We have already kind of touched on most of these areas, but just to review, these are kind of the areas, and even if those laws do not specifically mention manufactured home park communities, there's no reason that you cannot advocate for a direction from the overseeing state agency to ensure that local governments are planning around those communities. And again, as some of you have mentioned, some of you have already looked at funding leverage. Who is giving money to the governments, and where can you get them to condition those grants and funds on affordable housing performance? That can be very valuable. If you don't have some of these requirements, maybe there are possibilities at your state legislature or even at the local government level. So I think there's some real opportunities here in just about every locale. Next slide. So that covers it, and I welcome any more comments or questions.
It's in the program
Yeah,
booklet.
this is all in the program book. That's So thanks, Tim. That was great. We also wanted to just point out that pages 14 and 15 in the program book just give you a little overview of consolidated planning. I know you've got comprehensive planning and consolidated planning, comp plans and con plans. They're not the same, but they're complementary. Using another con word. And consolidated planning is also something that happens on a regular basis and allows you to have input into, again, the affordable housing demands and requirements in your local jurisdiction. So, and consolidated planning also happens on an annual basis with a big, big change in the plan or big amendments. Maybe 5 years, I believe it is, but also annual action plans. And so, we're talking kind of in theory here about how comprehensive planning and consolidated planning can make a difference. But it'll only make a difference if you get involved. So, how many of you know where you would go to find out when your comprehensive planning process is happening or your consolidated planning community meetings are happening? Are people on email lists? Do you know when to show up for those meetings? I see Tina's nodding her head and Dave's got his hand up. But, okay.
I'm on an email list where every month we're told when this meeting will be and what the topic will be discussed.
All right, and how many of you are going to those meetings? One or two, I see, but okay. That's not going to make a difference, is it? I mean, going to meetings is boring as hell, right? But whining and complaining about the fact that your community is closing and that there are fewer and fewer manufactured housing communities around isn't going to make a difference. It's about getting involved. It's about getting onto those email lists, getting those notifications of when the meetings are going to happen, and showing up and saying, this comprehensive plan or this consolidated plan doesn't even mention manufactured housing, right? They'll count the number of single-family homes, they'll count the number of apartment buildings, but it blows my mind that a lot of these plans don't even have the words manufactured housing communities in them. And that's a significant wrong, in my opinion, when they just completely overlook the fact that you're all there. Does that mean you don't count? I mean, we talked earlier this morning about being co-investors, about having value in our homes, about, right, the fact that we want to live in them going forward. But if we're not even identified and counted by the entities that can help us stay there, we're in a bad situation. Jackie?
Even one person at those meetings helps.
Absolutely.
We'd love to have more, but even one person. I've watched things turn around in a meeting because one person was willing to stand up and be counted.
I think it was great that we had Pamela Danner from HUD here this morning, and she was able to stay and hear a lot of the personal stories that you shared during the State of the States presentation. I think she got her eyes open to the situation, the realities that a lot of you are facing. So if someone from HUD who's already invested and involved and working in manufactured housing issues can be so readily educated by the experts, which you all are, because you all live and breathe manufactured housing, then imagine how much more powerful your stories are when you tell them to people who don't have a clue. And you're right, showing up at the public hearings, because that's your opportunity to speak. You are the public, you have a voice. Elected officials and their staffs are your public servants. It's your tax dollars that pay their salaries. They should be listening to you, and they should be making sure that they're responding to your request. Because very often no one's showing up at city council meetings, and then when you all show up in your bright green shirts, you are going to have an impact. Or your yellow ones in Utah, or the red ones in Delaware, whatever it is, right? We've all got our shirts. We should all be wearing our shirts. But thank you, APAC, for wearing yours. And I think that's where we need to start really impacting things. Charlie.
I'm listening.
Good.
And I think if you go to city council meetings, or if it's a large city like Minneapolis or a small one like Roseburg or Caneyville where I live, they organize their efforts towards things that are going to improve their community, things that are going to create an economy, things that are going to change. So when they look at manufactured homes, parks, they don't look at it as things that are going to improve. They see the aging of those parks. They say, these are things that we got to change. So we have to create an economy here too. So let's change this, and that improves our economy. Our argument has to be, and for us to attend that city hall meeting and have an impact, we need to have a source of information or proof documentation that we are of value, and many of us don't have that power or ability. Can you provide that information to us? Can you list that argument so that we can go in there a little bit better educated than we are?
So you have value. You absolutely have value. And I think more and more you will have value, because more and more manufactured housing communities are going to be the only source of affordable housing in jurisdictions. And comprehensive plans and consolidated plans, as Tim said, require the jurisdictions to show that they're providing housing for the 30% and below AMI, the 60% and below area median income, the 80% and below area median income. 80% and below area median income is all considered low income. There's low income, 80% and below, very low income, 60% and below, extremely low income, 30% and below. So you're probably all in that category somewhere. And so when you're the only source, your homes are the only ones that are affordable for those categories of people, they're going to have to recognize that. And that's why Boulder has a contract with the National Manufactured Homeowners Association, because the Boulder City Council saw that, oh my gosh, in Boulder we have high-end homes that are very, very expensive, and we have manufactured homes that are currently our only source of affordable housing. We're not going to meet any of the Growth Management Act requirements, any of the comprehensive or consolidated plan requirements, unless we preserve this housing. And so more and more you're going to find that you are going to have value, and that city councils are going to actually have to figure out ways to preserve your housing, or else they're not going to be able to meet their consolidated and comprehensive planning goals. So hang on to that thought, and you have value. You shop in the areas, you work in the areas, you spend money in the areas. You all live and breathe and hang out where your homes are. And your city council members need to know that, because most of the community owners do not live right there in that community. They are not voting for those elected officials. You are. And if, one thing that we all know about elected officials, they know that seniors vote. So, there's at least some of you in here that meet that criteria, being over 65.
But the majority of your manufactured parks are family-owned and not seniors, and yet the majority of the people who care or show an interest or discuss these things are the seniors. So it seems like it's only seniors doing this. We need better representation of the overall population of
we do, and I would suggest that part of the problem with that is that a lot of people of working age are having to work 1 or 2 jobs to keep food on the table and the roof over their families' heads, that they will get involved when they get to a stage in their lives where they have more time. But that's the one luxury that a lot of seniors do have, is the time. And you're working for yourselves, but you're also working for everybody else. And I think that's okay, right? Because while they're working 2 jobs to put their kids through schools, who are going to become the doctors and the nurses that are going to take care of all of us when we're in our retirement homes. So you're working for them to keep their homes, as they work for you to educate their kids to take care of you later. We're all in it together at some level. And I think that it's okay that it's mostly seniors right now, because that's the way it is. And we would love to have more families involved, but we get the fact that they're already over their heads just working this.
You proved my point. Say, can I get this in writing so I, as a person who attends this meeting, who is not as skilled as you are presenting it, but if I was able to use your information in putting this forth to the city, I'd be better off.
Census is one place to look, right? The census has some, at least, data on the number of manufactured homes in a jurisdiction. Unfortunately, there's very little data out there. It's something we're going to be talking about at the CFED conference next week, how to get more data, because you're right, a lot of data can make a difference. Personal stories also make a huge difference. So it doesn't have to just be data driven. There's a lot that you can do just telling your personal story. And you're all very credible presenters. You're the best presenters of your situation. You're the experts in your situation. And so the fact that you become more and more skilled at talking in front of the microphone and telling your story in a very concise way, not wandering off into other things, but practice the 3-minute, right? The 3-minute speech in front of the mirror. That's all you need. You don't need more than 3 minutes to tell a powerful story, and that's all you have usually at legislative hearings or city council meetings. But practice that, and you will make a huge impact.
And don't forget to add the fact that you are not only speaking for yourself as a senior, but you're also speaking for those younger folks who are wrapping up their lives.
I got young folks right here, and I suggest every senior stop and spend a little time and talk to them. I'm serious, because that's the future. They're here.
This is Christine and Lizette. They're from CFED. They're kindly co-sponsoring our convention. They actually don't live in manufactured homes, but I'm sure they'd be happy. So we're almost at the end of our time, but Tina, do you have a question?
I visited their website, and this gentleman here, they have toolkits there that...
We'll be talking about the toolkits right after lunch.
Okay.
Yeah,
that
a lot of good information.
That are very helpful.
Some of them are in here. So any final questions for Tim? Terry.
Yeah. Also, what I've discovered going to local government, city and county, is they are not, I mean, we know what we want from them. Affordable housing, keeping our communities, what can we do for them? Many of them do not realize that their seed money for the city, that the landlord pays for the roads, the sewer, the trees, and indirectly we're kind of helping them save money. And so that seems to be a good selling point for some of these local governments.
Any final words for us, Tim? Nope, I don't think so. All right, well, Tim, thank you very much. So lunch will be served, I think, at 12:30. We've given you an hour and a half, well, an hour and 45 minutes for lunch, so you can network and get to know each other better. We will try to increase the heat for this afternoon. I'm sorry it's been so cold this morning. We'll try to warm up the room. But we could do jumping jacks or something right now. All right, thanks everyone. We're adjourned till 2 o'clock.